the old writings, as old as the writings of Plato might be, for me at least, he continues to pose questions that are of import for our time. And there is much in Plato's writing with which I might disagree, but the conversation remains superlative. And I'm going to jump to the description of the conversation between Thuth and Themis, which is the opening conversation for the book Technopoly that I published in 1992. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that conversation. In Psalm, we had two gods which were often in conversation with one another, reported in Plato's dialogue called the Phaedrus. One of the gods was named Thuth, and he was an inventor of all sorts of wonderful things, including numbers and astronomy and geometry and so wonderful things, and writing. And he approached his friend, who was also a god and also a king, Themis, and said to Themis, "This is a recipe for memory. I have this thing called writing, removing ourselves from oral context and being able to write things down. It's a recipe for memory and wisdom. People will be wise. People will know more and have more and be able to be wise." And Themis responds, "Oh, no, 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 my friend. This is not a recipe for memory. This is a recipe for recollection and forgetfulness. That is to say, people will no longer need to access what is inside them by way of memory, but rather depend upon the externals." And this was problematic for Themis, and certainly was important for me as I approached this problem of technology in 1992. What I'd like to do quickly is to talk a little bit about one of the first principles. This has been advanced already this morning, so I can't spend too much time on this. But the notion that technology gives and technology also takes away. Freud, at one moment, praises the telegraph that allows a loved one to say, "I am safely home," but at the same time, he laments the technology that allows them to move so far away from home in the first place. So we have technology giving, technology taking away. We might question whether computer technology has been of benefit to the masses of the people. I wrote that in 1992, and I have to blush a little bit about that. I do hold that in many ways computer technology has invaded our lives and made what should be private public, and that's problematic. But I am forced to acknowledge that for many entities on my list in Technopoly, steelworkers, vegetable store owners, etc., some of the technology truly has been beneficial. Teachers do use the internet, at least I acknowledge, perhaps shamefacedly, that I occasionally do as well. Farmers employ drone and computer technology to manage effective farming practices and so on. I also wanted to take a minute simply to acknowledge that we use the internet, especially in all kinds of ways that perhaps it certainly was not in use when I was writing in 1992. Some people use internet information, the computer, as their physician. Instead of seeking help from a healthcare professional, they go and get information, whether it is accurate or not, wise or not. My comment about this is that information does not always speak well or wisely for itself, and certainly with regard to individuals solving their own healthcare problems, that might be an example of that. And I'm very proud of myself for remembering the phrase "informing ourselves to death," which of course I had forgotten, but I wrote so many years ago. We have computer using it as a form of e-commerce. It is possible to live one's life from morning till noon, day by day, without ever having to leave the threshold of one's door, because one can use Amazon Prime to get any manner of groceries and materials delivered to the home. You can go online and do an exercise workout that gives you the perfect physique and health, hopefully, and so on. Purveyor of spiritual solutions. I was intrigued by this because as I was admittedly looking at my computer one day, I noticed something from a physician saying, "You should check out this opportunity to do your prayer and meditation more efficiently and quickly." Nobody has 2 hours for prayer and meditation, one of the person's affairs, and so you can do it in just a few minutes, and then you get all the benefits of prayer and meditation. And I thought, well, there's spirituality for you. So the list of internet technology benefits is long, and we certainly have observed and heard about some of the shortfalls on it. The thing that I was more interested interested in, at least for today, is the notion of how we measure technology. And that is to say that, and I wrote this in '92, the measure of technology ought not be solely based on the benefit or harm deriving from its utility or function, which is short-sighted. Famous tells us that. But also has to be regarded in inclusion with form. Now, in '92 I wrote, we may learn that once a technology is admitted, it plays out its hand, it does what it's designed to do. Our task is to understand that design, that is to say, when we admit a new technology, we must do so with our eyes wide open. And as I review my words, I realized I made an error, at least I failed to make a very important distinction and clarification. We use the word designed to do, which might imply what the designer intends it to do. But what I want to suggest that even more important than that is designed to do includes all of the mischief that a form allows it to do, because those are the most pernicious kinds of problems that we may have with certain kinds of technologies. I'd like to talk for a moment about Twitter. Many people acknowledge that this 2016 presidential election may in fact have strongly been influenced in the way that it went because of Twitter, and we certainly have lots of information about that. Comedians, nighttime comedians make a great play with all of that. But what I took a look at was the design of Twitter. Jack Dorsey developed it. It was an idea. He had a new iPhone. They were relatively rare. He wanted to be able to text friends, but all his friends didn't have iPhones. And so he said, well, I'd like a platform that allows me to send one message to all of my friends in a single moment, whether they're on their computer, their cell phone, or whatever kind of technology they access. Well, so then he gets together with some other people from the podcast group he works with, and all within a year, what we now know as Twitter. It wasn't called that initially. They had to fight for the right to call it that, but Twitter was born. Well, was his intention that it would be used in the kind of way it has come to be used? Well, certainly it's used in presidential politics. Feminist scholarship have acknowledged the presence of a set of Twitter wars in which women presumably should be engaged in more civil discourse, engage in vitriolic and very unkind discourse, again, because the medium and form of Twitter allows that, and many, many such examples. But an interview with Jack, I used his name a moment ago. Dorsey, thank you. I had it here. Okay. I'm forgetting something. An interview with him suggests that he never ever thought in terms of it becoming the kind of tool that it has become. He just wanted it as a way for people to talk to each other. 140 characters. What kind of harm can you do in 140 characters? Well, we know that has proved to be an interesting question. My final comment, and I don't have time to develop this in any length, has to do with notions of civility. And this is where I come back to famous. The idea that instruction in information is required in order for that information to lead to wisdom. And one of the things that contemporary ethical theories, especially the dialogic notions of cooperative and collaborative ethics, hold that we have to have the other and the other human being in mind as we proceed. And it seems to me that a lot of the technology that is used for political civic conversations are not fostering that kind of human interaction that allows for consideration of the oral interaction with other people. I wish I had more time. I wanted to ask about efficiency as a key value, which maybe is one of the reasons why we were so energetic about the computer and why certain uses of it make so much sense to us. But we want what? We want more time. And as our speaker this morning suggested, time for what? More time to make more money, or more time to develop more techniques, or more time to make more quilts, which happens to be, in my spare time, when I'm not close to my quilts. And so the point is that why are we in such a hurry to fill up our lives with so much? And again, the information does not come to us with its own meaning. It comes to us as raw, which I developed elsewhere in Technocracy, not in the first chapter. But at any rate, what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to have a self? To what extent is the self recreated through social media day in, day out? And what impact does that have on the individual experience of self? What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to participate actively in a democratic community? What does it mean to have at one's interest community? And these are things that I think are suffering as a consequence of an over-commitment to access to certain kinds of technology. And with that, I say thank you, and I am so glad for this water.
So if you're following along in the program, you'll notice we have an order that was put in there. Dr. Beard is the one who is not with us today. He was taking the chapter Loving Resistance Fighter and was to be speaking to the International Association, or Steampunk Association, which will convene, or has convened, I can't remember, in Cincinnati, Ohio. If you would like his essay, feel free to come up to me after. I'll take your email address and we'll send it to you so you can have a copy of it. Instead, Dr. Gore is going to be our next speaker, speaking on the chapter Scientism to the International Society for Religion, Literature, and Culture, which in this case, oh, I see what you did. You said at the University of Glasgow. Very nice. Dr. Gore.
Thank you. Whenever I'm in Scotland, I always stand. So, here we go. When last I wrote to you about scientism, I left you all to ponder this pressing question. Which is the most likely to serve the human interest, and which to prove most deadly in the age of technopoly? Belief in God, belief in scientism, or no belief at all in any ultimate source of moral authority? I couch the question with the secular caveat that it is possible that any one of these sources of moral authority is an illusion. Nevertheless, the question remains existentially charged, which is to say, the question remains deadly. No society on earth today can escape wrestling with what it means to believe in God, what it means to believe that science and technology can save us, or from pondering the possibility that there's nothing in the universe outside the authority which human beings construct for themselves from out of their cultures. Whether we speak of terrorism, capitalism, climatology, politics, education, technological advancement, or a host of other subjects, we cannot escape what feels to be an existential crisis facing human civilization and culture. With every exponential increase in information and knowledge, we seem light years away from the cultural tools we need to contemplate our death and the death of every living thing. If Socrates is right that philosophy is learning how to die, our civilization and culture could not be less philosophical than we are right now. In other words, modern secular societies have not removed from humanity the trouble of coming to terms with the meaning of life and death. Science and technological advances notwithstanding, contemporary society has merely transformed the idea of moral authority through a peculiar reevaluation of the meaning of empirical grounds. Instead of taking seriously the experience of familial love, friendship, or the justice of face-to-face communication, we continue to live by an irrational confidence in human rationality, in the methods of the natural sciences, in the rational organization of human societies, and in the faith that science and technology can save us from death, including those deaths caused by science and technology. The dissolution of modern societies and the demise of democracy are driven by a common cause, the failure of defining human problems in modern secular terms. To counteract this failure, I offer three theses in support of a worldview that will help us come to terms with the fact that humanity's knowledge is, like humanity itself, mortal, finite, and imperfect. Thesis 1, we die. Thesis 2, in the meantime, in the time of meaning, in the time that remains, we walk by faith. And thesis 3, our imperfections make our cultures both possible and desirable. Thesis 1, we die. The thesis that we die is actually harder to prove than it sounds. What I mean is that it's difficult to see our own death, to theorize death as it pertains to the possibility of our not being here. It has probably always been difficult to see our own death, and this is in part why religion was invented. Without constant reminders like shawls, beads, crucifixes, and so on, we forget death at every turn. Apocalyptic films and literature notwithstanding, it's relatively easy for us to skirt the contemplation of death, including the pending death of every living thing. Death is easily forgotten in the day-to-day challenge of living. Laundry needs to be done, diapers changed, lawns mowed, and something put on a plate. Indeed, much of what we do and how we spend our time are ways of whiling away the time, waiting to die, distracting us from the fact that we will die. This is as true of the ocean cruise industry as it is of theme parks, movie studios, and smartphone apps. Contemporary technological cultures have perfected the art of distraction, the art of dissipating the fear of death in a flood of information and informational tech. Not only does our popular culture sublimate death, but our educational culture is also driven by the immediate, the short term, in short, the secular. I'm using here Charles Taylor's sense of the secular in a secular age. I could say more about that, but perhaps when we come back. If we cannot remember the wisdom of the past, we are not likely to build a promising future. Much of culture now carries only a passing resemblance to the religious ideas which originally shaped them, religious ideas that were preoccupied with reminding us of death. Moreover, much of our technological culture has only a passing familiarity with history, with what happened before we were born. Without some kind of turn toward a culture that has a healthy respect for the past and for death, human societies are likely to digress into ever more barbaric and superficial grounds. As noted long ago by Socrates, examining life while we live is the best way to learn how to die. Cicero added, in a passage I've cited before, not to know what happened before you were born is to be a child forever. For what is the time of a man, except to be interwoven with the memory of ancient things of a superior age? Our lives and deaths are less meaningful if we know only what happens and what has happened while we live, and not what happened before we were born, before the internet was invented. Thesis 2, we walk by faith. Scientism is best understood as an excessive faith in science and technology, an overconfidence in the products of our minds and hands. I use the word faith deliberately here because I want to call attention to the impoverished and sometimes pejorative references we so-called modern mortals make toward faith. I'm not here about to suggest that we can live without faith. The claim that we live or walk by faith, of course, belongs most to Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul the Apostle, but I am not above asserting it here as a secular claim. I'm not the first to do this. The renowned skeptical philosopher and well-known atheist David Hume argued that we have no other way to live except by faith. In his book, The Stillborn God, Religion, Politics in the Modern West, Mark Lilla reasserts Hume's claim in this way. Not that faith is irrational, but that it is ubiquitous. While past experiences may lead me to expect that the egg before me is edible, I cannot be sure of it. Yet I dig in, taking it on faith that I will find a yolk and not poison. And I'm right to do so. The only sensible way to live, Hume suggests, is to accept that we are surrounded by uncertainty and must rely on custom and common feeling. Faith is things hoped for, and things not always easily seen. Faith operates when we bite into our breakfast, and also when we're drafting a lecture, theorizing subatomic particles, and taking off or landing a plane. The ubiquity of faith reminds us that we're surrounded by uncertainty. Of course, science is a helpful tool for reducing uncertainty in the world around us, but the problem is that it can often interfere with our reliance on common sense and shared feeling. In his brilliant article, Proverbial Economy, Stephen Shapman argues that scientists tend to dislike common sense forms of reasoning like proverbs and metaphors because they cannot be falsified, because they embody imprecise and superficial modes of inference, and because they represent a kind of knowledge that needs to be repaired by learned expertise. It is precisely these facets of common sense that Shapman celebrates by noting that generic ancestral wisdom embodied in proverbs represent, on the contrary, a widely distributed form of expertise in memory and timing. Only the right proverb, said at the right time and said in exactly the right way, will fit the occasion. In Aristotelian terms, proverbs belong to the process of deliberation, the taking of decisions about what to do. But often they're about what to do about what has been done, where absolute certainty is neither available nor rationally to be expected. Proverbs and maxims belong to the complex circumstances of life as it is lived, not to the idealizations of philosophers or scientists. They're aids to action, not in the domain of reason, but of reasonableness. Where science reduces uncertainty through the application of a disciplined form of reason, there are yet other disciplines that can likewise reduce uncertainty and make easier living from day to day. I will here mention only a few of them. Fasting, prayer, meditation, studying the Torah, which here stands in for studying any of the great religious texts brought forth on the earth, going for regular walks outside, cooking your own food, and conversing with your friends. None of these need to be carried on rationally or scientifically, but nor could we say with any confidence that these are practices that are irrational or unreasonable. Time and chance happen to all of us, and the vicissitudes of life cannot be weathered by science alone. We need other disciplines to make knowledge, to make meaning, indeed, to make life itself. Finally, thesis 3, our imperfections make our cultures possible. Human cultures are the product of leisure, and leisure is necessary because of human weakness and imperfection. Leisure is, of course, largely misunderstood in a techno-capitalist world. This is true in large part because we do not comprehend work properly. We conceptualize free time in terms of non-wage earning, non-capital producing time, but leisure ought to be thought of as much more than just free time, as something that has a legitimate constitution in its own right. Leisure is the basis of culture, as Joseph Piper has noted, a restful way of being in the world. Leisure is not the opposite of work. The opposite of work is idleness. Our technological devices, of course, are productive of so much idleness: binge watching, mobile gaming apps, the ceaseless buzzing and updating of our phones. All of this constitutes a distracting way of life that cannot be called leisurely. What we need is to reinvigorate our sense of being calmly present in the world, renewing our understanding that leisure can be productive in its own right, rather than wasted time, will remind us of what it means to have a healthy culture. One way to do this is to think more purposely about holidays. Another is to recall that we need different kinds of work in order to re-energize ourselves. A third might be to simply remember that a restful, leisurely life means making time to go for a walk, or to talk to our friends and family, to sit again around the table, and time to step beyond the workaday world, to be what we are without hurrying about what we are. Leisure and culture should be our greatest cause for celebration. Leisure is the opportunity to be what we are, to practice a way of life that is both productive and restful, meaningful and connected to others with bonds of affection that are stronger than texts and tweets. Our social connections need depth as well as immediacy, sustained contact and face-to-face encounters more than merely touching base. In conclusion, because we die, we must work to make our lives meaningful while we live. No one can be an expert on how to live a meaningful life, but walking by faith and living in a leisurely way can create the space we need to make meaning. Productive leisure helps keep us from being weighed down by our imperfections. Productive faith helps us remember that we must build our cultures on restfulness as well as on work, on sharing time together as well as on technical achievements, and on history and sentiment as well as science. Distraction and disinhibition cannot be the basis of a healthy, productive culture, and that is the most scientism offers us if we allow it to become the basis of our way of life. The antidote is to remember death, to walk by faith, to overcome imperfections through cultural labor that restores and renews human societies and human beings.
Our third postman imposter is Dr. Downs, who is tackling the great symbol drain chapter in the book and is speaking allegedly to the American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference and Exhibit, which ironically is apparently meeting right here in San Francisco, California. Dr. Downs.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Aaron, for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be able to address the American Pediatric Association today to discuss children's relationships with media and technology. It is appropriate to begin this discussion with Plato's Phaedrus, in which we find that Socrates is a vocal critic of the written word. He gives preference to dialogue. He fears that if Athenian youth come to rely too heavily on writing, it will serve to erode their memory. He goes on to say that the new medium of writing will give them not truth, but only the semblance thereof, that they will hear many things, but learn nothing, that they will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing, and that they will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. I suppose it is normal for elders, teachers, parents, and the like to be critical of their children's academic achievement and work ethic. This appears to be especially true during times of rapid technological change and advancement, the times when the tools of the trade change from generation to generation. Berliner and Biddle referred to this as Socrates' legacy. In this regard, not much has changed in the relationship between elders and youth in the last 2,400 years. However, I think you would all agree that the relationships between children and technology have certainly changed dramatically. Consider some of the following changes. For the first time in history, our children get more screen time per day than they get sleep. The individual child is now required to have a mobile computer and many educational programs. Media convergence has turned our telephones into everything but a telephone. The internet is in our children's pockets. And conversations, if indeed they can be called such, consist of LOL, BRB, and OMG. These are acknowledged with a thumbs up, a smiley face, or even, heaven help us, an eggplant. To all of this, I state in the language that our children uniquely understand, WTF. To be fair, This isn't necessarily the world that our children have asked for, but it is undoubtedly the world that they have inherited. And it should come as no surprise to us as adults that the most vulnerable of our population have given in to the technological evangelists and resigned their fates to the symbols of their time: internet-ready cell phones, tablets, gaming devices, and personal computers. Now, none of this, of course, would be possible without techno-prophets like Bill Gates. You see, some things haven't changed in 25 years. And his team of techno-evangelists. Recently, a team of said techno-evangelists released a statement and promotional video for a product called Microsoft HoloLens. This, if you don't know, is an augmented reality device. They stated that with this device, quote, "we have revolutionized STEM education," unquote. Now bear in mind, this is a product that isn't going to be released to the general public for another 3 to 5 years. While the device is a technological triumph in the eyes of some, it certainly begs the question, how bad is STEM education currently that an unreleased product has already significantly improved it? In an era where technology is the symbol of its time, it is not surprising that technology at all costs is the mantra by which many live. We know today that in order to sell a piece of technology, it is not important to know what is good about the product, but rather it is more important to know what is wrong with the user. This attitude is perhaps nowhere more prevalent than in the offices where social media apps are produced. In an attempt to control the world with more free information, social media companies and their architects have turned to the literature on gambling addiction to understand how repetitive motions, such as those performed by a slot machine player, can keep people engaged and entertained to the point that they begin to damage their own financial security. The compulsion loop is their answer to this phenomenon, a model that is designed to take advantage of people's insecurity. Consisting of a repetitive sequence of action, reward, and anticipation, social media programmers are encouraged to find the magical sequence of events designed to get that user hooked on their latest application. It works like this. I post a photo, I anxiously await responses and validation, I get likes and comments, and then with that validation, an oh so glorious neurochemical response in the brain, a drip of dopamine. As the drip is small, it doesn't last long. So I repeat the process over and over and over. The variable reward compulsion loop, which takes advantage of the uncertainty of responses, much as a slot machine disperses different sized rewards, keeps the user guessing. Do they like me? Do they like me now? What about now? Still now? How about now? Much like gambling, it is habitual at its best and addictive at its worst. There's one more anecdote that I wish to share on the nature of our times with regard to children, media, and technology. This past semester, I taught a course on media and technological literacy. On the first day, as I often do, I began the course with a series of questions. The first question I asked, how many people here have previously taken a media literacy course? Out of approximately 40 students, one hand went up. My second question, how many of you have taken a gun safety course? About 60% of the hands in the classroom went up. Keep in mind that this incarnation of the postman teaches in Minnesota. We then tried to figure out how much time was spent per day engaging in both of these activities. After some debate, we arrived at the conclusion that the average student spends 6 hours per day with media. And for those who would shoot, about 4.5 hours per year. In daily terms, this translates into about 45 seconds. Why do you suppose, I then inquired, that given the disparity in times, so many more people take gun safety courses than media and technological literacy courses? The most common student response, because guns can hurt and kill people. Just let that response sink in for a moment. In my opinion, the single biggest problem that we have in our society today isn't technological evangelism, or for that matter, compulsion loops, although make no mistake, they come with their own sets of issues. But the biggest problem is the fact that our children don't see the dangers that these technologies and mediums present. For that matter, nor do most adults. Did 6 million Jews not die in the Holocaust, in part because of propaganda spread through technological mediums? Did 4,500 adolescents not commit suicide last year, many in part caused by anonymous cyberbullying? And did almost 5,000 people not die, and over 500,000 injured in 2016 on US roadways because some piece of technology distracted a driver? The consequences of such a misguided thought process are dire. And as media literacy scholar David Considine laments, while more young people have access to the internet and other technological mediums than any generation in history, they do not necessarily possess the ethics, the intellectual skills, or the predisposition to critically analyze and evaluate their relationships with these technologies or the information that they subsequently encounter. In other words, good hand-eye coordination and perceived abilities to multitask are not substitutes for critical thinking. In a day and age where technology has helped to create a disposable society, just swipe left to get to the next person, and where gun safety courses appear to be more the norm than media and technological literacy, we know that media and technological literacy needs to take its rightful place, front and center in our national dialogue, more now than ever before. In closing, I leave you with this. It is not without some irony, and perhaps a little regret, that having published more than 20 books on the topic, that I acknowledge that maybe Socrates was right. We don't need more writing on the topic of media and technological literacy. Given the current state of affairs, it seems to me that we would be much better served if instead we just started having more conversations with our children. Thank you.
As it were, I am going to bring up the rear with writing an essay about the chapter Broken Defenses and intending to give it to the Society for Professional Journalism Excellence in Journalism Conference, scheduled to be held in Anaheim, California. It is an honor to be here to speak briefly about what seems like a crisis in journalism. Of course, journalism is a sort of thing like parking. Nobody ever seems happy with it, but most people recognize we need it. So there we are, stuck between the bedrock notion of journalism as an essential aspect of a functioning democracy and the hard place of public perception about your craft. The longer one dwells on it, the more bizarre the problem appears. One idiom we have employed for bizarre problems, of course, is down the rabbit hole, from Charles Lutwidge Dodgson's, who most people know as Lewis Carroll. His story, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, whence the phrase comes, began life as an oral tale in a boat, and whose main character is named after one of the young teenage girls in the boat listening to the story being told for what might have been the first time. Later, Alice Liddell asked Dodgson to write it down. The mathematician did, thankfully, and for more than 150 years the book has never been out of print and has been published in no less than 174 different languages, so that today it comes to pass that I should like to lean on a couple of phrases from it, which, with any luck, may be familiar to you in a new way when I am through talking. We are in a rabbit hole, aren't we? How far down it, no one knows. But even the term seems in favor now. In Disney's film rendition of Carol's classic tale, you may recall Alice peeks inside the tree and says, "My, what a peculiar place to have a party." She crawls in anyway, with the naive optimism of a child, and then proceeds to fall down the hole. One thing that stands out to me now about that scene, as her dress slows her fall like a parachute, is that her descent is marked by both fear and joy, by both danger and pleasure. Readers of my work will know I am attracted to this contrast, having opened my most famous book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, by contrasting the big brother dangers from George Orwell's hand in 1984 with the centrifugal bumble puppy pleasures of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Allow me a brief but necessary interlude. By bringing up a rabbit hole in what seems like a crisis in journalism, you may already be guessing that I am going to talk somewhat negatively about your situation. So first I must be sure to make it plain to this audience that I am not, nor ever have been, a journalist. Perhaps that is why you have given me only 10 minutes or so to speak. Given just this last year in your field, I can imagine that what you most need from this conference is respite. You probably came to this conference to be among your colleagues, to feel good about yourselves and your situation. Anaheim, being near Hollywood, is both geographically and symbolically opposed to the public affairs governing our nation across the land. And you should feel good about your work, as far as I am concerned. We do not suffer from a lack of high-quality journalism, in my view. You suffer from an information ecology that is hostile to your goals. Because I do believe that, it follows that I also believe you have chosen one of the most difficult careers there is. Your job is not easy. In fact, I can scarcely imagine it. And so I hope you do get some respite here, but for the next few minutes, I feel I have no choice but to cast a bit of a dark cloud over you in sunny Southern California. Bear with me. It may be necessary to get to a brighter day. Now then, contrasting danger and pleasure was necessary for amusing ourselves to death, which was about how television erodes serious public discourse, mainly by trying to display it in a medium that is not suited to it. Often I am tempted to extrapolate from that thesis to make sense out of the problems surrounding journalism today. From 2008 to 2009, we shifted from most people reporting to survey administrators that they get their news online more than they do from television. There was a shift in medium that year, in the conduit from which most people get most of their news. Publishers were, of course, hastening this shift by scrambling to put content there because it seemed appropriate, fearing somehow getting left behind in what seems always ever like the natural advance of technology. So it seems to me reasonable to just simply wonder to what degree the internet is or is not in some sense transmitting information televisually, and to try to apply the thesis in that book to the situation today. But though tempting, I do not think that is your chief problem. The internet begs the problem of information glut, and because it is virtually a convergence of all media, its fitness for serious public discourse is likely not the problem. Rather, the defenses against information glut have been broken down. A problem which all of you in this room, whether information producer or consumer, no doubt feels. I rendered this condition of information glut as a symptom in a technopoly. In fact, I wrote a book called Technopoly, a term which I use to define the state of mind consisting of the deification of technology, which means that a culture seeks its authorization in technology, finds its satisfaction in technology, and takes its orders from technology. Information glut, you might say, is what happens to a culture overcome by information generated by technology when a culture is what happens to a culture overcome by information generated by technology tries to employ technology itself as a means of providing clear direction and humane purpose. There can be almost no doubt that we have this state of mind. Consider not just the internet, but also the Internet of Things, a term that in 2015, almost 9 in 10 people had never heard of, despite the fact that in that year, there were almost as many things connected to the internet as there are people. 4.9 billion, to be specific. As we sit here today, for the first time, there are more things connected than people. By the end of 2017, it is projected that 8.4 billion internet things will be connected, roughly 1 billion more things than there are people in the world. Not all of them are as yet still even on the internet. Of course, the division is specious, as whole industries will develop with the aim of profiting by connecting somehow the things and the people. In 3 years' time, 1.7 megabytes of new information will be created every second for every human being on the planet, at which time our accumulated digital universe will grow to about 44 trillion gigabytes. People have labeled me a Luddite in the past, a label which I rather like for specific reasons, but suffice to say, I am not the right person to make sense of 44 trillion gigabytes. I doubt any of us is. The scale is too large. But the most telling statistic of all is the fact that in 2015, according to researchers from MIT, only 0.5% of all that data is ever analyzed and used. 0.5% of the data being generated is being used. It seems clear to me that our culture has deified technology. For heaven's sakes, Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2015 was an emoji, deviating from a long tradition of actually using words for the word of the year honor. The following year, it was post-truth, a word which portends that our culture is confounded with the problems of information created by technology. Examples of attempts to solve this problem with more technology are not hard to locate. In this year's presidential election, among other problems, fake news proliferated. Eli Pariser, a 36-year-old entrepreneur and author who knows a thing or two about the internet, created a Google Doc to which anyone could access and into which anyone could put solutions to the problem. I know of at least 2 teams of scholars who have applied for and been given hundreds of thousands of dollars of grant money to develop an algorithm to solve the problem of fake news. I am not prepared today to speak to the utility of these ideas, though I doubt they will be successful, but rather bring them to your attention as exhibits A and B of how we try to solve the problem of information glut with more information. We live in a technopoly. It is new, it is unfolding rapidly and rather completely over a culture so as to quite indelicately change our ecology. Part of our adjusting to is recognizing that the problems of journalism, even just considering fake news, for example, are going to require ecological solutions, not informational ones. Our approach thus far has been rather cancerous, an analogy I once forwarded in a chapter called Broken Defenses in Technopoly, a chapter which I think may be useful for journalists to think about going forward. I would go so far as to say that fake news is a tumor in the cancerous information ecology we have created. The cure for cancer isn't growing more cells, it has mainly been to stop them from growing. Likewise, I wrote in Technopoly that the cure for information glut is likely to come from the development of social institutions' ability to constrain information, to place and monitor what counts as information, the way, for example, the legal system does, or even the catalog of majors that are meant to be taken as legitimate areas of study at a university. But a culture that is as defined as we are by the First Amendment and not given to constraining information, but a culture is not likely to use this solution. And so, unless we innovate some ways to constrain or at least to limit information, I think we are likely going to be stuck with this problem and some new ones for a long time to come. As Alice is falling somewhat blissfully down the rabbit hole, she eventually lands on her feet and sees the rabbit scurry through a door which closes. She opens it, which opens to another one, and another one, and another one. This is the idea which I think your organization needs to begin to embrace in earnest. Though I am not a journalist, I am aware that there is a long-standing controversy over whether or not journalists are actually professionals. The title of your group rather hides this controversy, I should say, but it is there, and you know it better than I do. A true professional society has layers of doors so that not everyone gets in, and more importantly, to control and manage standards, which is just another way of saying to manage what counts as information. Perhaps if your group of practitioners really were professionals, we wouldn't also need PolitiFact, a growing website and collection of so-called truth seekers that has been in business now for a decade. I have neither the time nor the good ideas to bring to try to solve this problem for you, so I shall leave you today with a roadmap. So I shall not leave you today with a roadmap, nor do I mean to suggest that organizing into a profession, as, for example, lawyers do, is necessarily the best answer or the right one. There is a reason this is a long-standing debate in your field. But I will say, however, that this body, if any, should be serious about trying to recognize the problem of journalism as an ecological one, and to try to reckon solutions at that level. Unless that happens, I fear the information environment will become increasingly jabberwocky, characterized by an increasing amount of jabberwocky talking, perhaps, and the impact of serious journalism that already continues to exist will find itself tumbling continuously down a rabbit hole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all of you for for these stimulating papers, and I'll make a few comments as your respondent. And I'd like to start on when Aaron, in introducing this, you questioned whether you're the right people who are doing this. And I do want to say that, of course you are. And you know, one thing that we have to be cautious about in the period of time in which there still are people who personally knew a particular figure like Postman or McLuhan, is to attach too much importance to personal relationships, because at a certain point that may drown out other understandings and investigations into the person's work. And I mean, I can say unequivocally that there were many people who studied with Neil Postman who really did not understand media ecology and were not very interested in understanding it, but who still may claim to have some special knowledge about that sort of thing. And there are disputes going on now about some individuals who worked with McLuhan and their particular interpretation of McLuhan, which probably wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for that personal connection. So it's great that you're doing this, and in the future, this is the only way that anyone's going to do this. So, you know, of course, if you disagree with me, you're wrong, but that's what Neil would say. But you know, but we all have our slice. I mean, it's always a relationship, so it's always Neil Postman in my lens and in my experience and my relationship, my slice of him, which is going to be different from yours. So start with Elizabeth Nelson talking about famous, as I like to refer to him, and ending with many good questions. And Postman was a firm believer in the importance of asking good questions. Very much adamant that when people say there's no such thing as a bad question, they're being idiots, because there are many bad questions. But the important thing are the good questions, because the answers can change, but good questions remain with us. And you mentioned the idea that technology gives and takes away, and the way I like to look at it is it's a cost and a benefit, and there's no free lunch. Every benefit comes with a cost. And you know, for those of you who are social scientists, there's such a thing as cost-benefit analysis, and we just say, is it worth it? Nothing's going to be free, and nothing's going to be completely bad and evil either. I mean, the question is the trade-off. You mentioned how to measure technology. I have some qualms on that, because if you ask how do we measure it, that's a quantitative. You know, that asks for a quantitative answer.
I was quoting myself.
Okay, but yeah, I'm just saying, you know, that measure is not the perhaps the preferred mode of assessment. And when you talk about how technology is designed, the way I would break it down, and a little plug, I've got a new book coming out on media ecology in I don't know, in a month or two. And you know, that's talking about the characteristics of the medium. So you have the medium. We also have the bias of the medium, which really refers to the tendencies that the way that it will be used and the tendencies of what it'll do. And then we talk about the effects, which have always been a kind of tricky area. But one of the key points would be that the effects there always are unanticipated effects, impossible to foresee, especially because whatever the design may be, you're changing something, that's going to change something else, that's going to change something else. There's going to be all of this sort of cascading interactions, and we never quite know what's going to happen, what's going to come out of it. And how then the environment, our other key term, is going to change. I feel at the present, well, here we go, better than when somebody's phone rang during Postman's funeral service, and the dial tone was an earlier era, was take me out to the ball game. and we all laughed because Neil was also a big baseball fan. But I was a little horrified because I happened to have had the same dial tone, and people knew that, ringtone, people knew that. It wasn't me, though. But in any event, I think, the real, what I'm seeing, in America today, the problem we're seeing is amusing ourselves to death. That's coming up a lot. The alternative seems to be efficiency, seems to be technopoly. And, of the two, I mean, it seems like maybe technopoly is the lesser of the two evils, but it does seem like it's either going to be one or the other. And that a lot of the arguments against what the current administration are in favor of efficiency and effective government. So there may be no way out of this thing. Anyway, I have to get to the others. David Gore on scientism. One point I would stress, and I didn't quite get that from your talk, was that scientism primarily refers to use of language and the kind of rhetoric. Kenneth Burke also talks quite a bit about scientism. So it is the tendency to rely on the language of science in inappropriate ways and to use things like statistics in very selective ways, because it was in Mark Twain's line, lies, damn lies, and statistics, to use them in very manipulative kinds of ways. You bring up death, and certainly a key point in there is Ernest Becker's denial of death, where he argues that this is sort of the basis of all human culture, is to make up for the fact that we're the only form of life that's aware of its own mortality, that's a crushing blow for us, and in order to allow us to function, culture provides us with the means to sort of repair our self-esteem and live life heroically with that knowledge. In addition to Becker's denial of death, I mentioned Corey Anton's book, Sources of Significance, as a good source on that. You can pay me later, Corey. But I like what you have to say. I mean, it's certainly questioned. There is a certain trade-off between science versus faith, and science does tend to look at the world in an I-it kind of way, as opposed to the I-you. And that's also I-it goes with a visual orientation, I-you with an oral, dialogic orientation. I would conclude that, though, with a call for balance between the two, because it's certainly consistent with Postman, and he's critical of science as it allies with, and really is in a sense subjugated to technology and to technopoly, but that science in the sense of knowledge, rationality, was very important for him. And so there's a need for the balance between the two. And I'd say to be consistent with scientific knowledge, not to go against it, which is what deniers of climate change or of evolution, that's the problem, is when you go against scientific knowledge, or of genetics, which is what happened in the Soviet Union back in the early 20th century. So we can't deny it, but we have to balance it out at the same time. For Edward Downes, certainly childhood was very significant for Neil Postman, talking about that. I think he would very much be in agreement about the need for conversation. I think the absolute importance of talking to children, reading books out loud, I think is also very significant, and having an environment where books and reading are encouraged. Because again, for Postman, it was not an either-or between orality and literacy. Rather, the either-or was between word, which is both spoken and literate, and in a modern sense, to exist in good balance between that and the image orientation of contemporary culture, and as well as the numbers view of technopoly. So it is in the word and the use of language that the emphasis would be placed. I think he, like many of us in media ecology, have some concerns or some qualms about the term media literacy, since we're advocates of literacy, and of maintaining the distinctions between literacy and other forms of media. But he was not above allying himself with media literacy just to get the point across. And finally, for Aaron, it absolutely was the case that information glut and the broken defenses, and there's also a reference to AIDS in that as a cultural form of AIDS was very much a concern that was informing ourselves to death. Made me think when you mentioned the Internet of Things that all of the Internet is an Internet of Things. It was never an Internet of people. It was a way of connecting computers to one another, not people. And originally it was to transfer files that people were working on. I do think it's very, very interesting to consider how the solution to technological problems in a technopoly is always more technology. And that's what Alul talked about, Levinson talked about, historically remedial media, which is, you have a window, you need to invent a window shade. You have to have a telephone, you invent the telephone answering machine. And in the same way, I think you're right, I mean, it's algorithms, that's what we're talking about, algorithms to, now Facebook wants to create algorithms to remove fake news and that sort of thing. And that's always going to be the approach that's taken, but that's not going to be the answer in the end. And as you address journalism, I think it's worth considering the point about professions, which is an outgrowth of specialization that comes from print culture. And what we're seeing now is an assault on professions. I will note that another media ecology scholar who Neil was friendly with, and who was very close with Jerry Brown, the governor, was Ivan Illich, also appropriate in this setting because he was a priest. And in addition to being critical about technology, Illich was very critical about professionalism and its use to exclude people from knowledge, and often in a way that covered up any kind of wrongdoing. And so that critique comes, and it was an important critique to be made against the sort of misuse of professional boundaries. But at the same time, we are seeing an assault on professionalism in part through the technology that makes medical information readily available, that makes it possible to do lawyerly things online without going to see a lawyer, or get your education online without actually talking to a teacher. So that is going on, but it's also going on politically. And that's one of the characteristics particularly and one of the criticisms of conservative politics, of Trump and those type of folks, is that a lot of the assault is, the Republicans for long have been critical of lawyers, but there's also been a general assault on the professions, and with it the kind of monopoly of knowledge that, again, on the one hand can be problematic, but on the other hand means that you have experienced people bringing you the news, as well as experienced people saying, yes, climate change is real. Right? That's knowing that professional scientists, what they have to say means a little bit more than what some idiot elected to Congress is saying, or some jerk with a blog is putting out there, or some moron with Twitter saying. So I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, and it's probably a worthwhile topic for going further in professionalism as it relates to our changing media. environment. So I just want to end by commending you for this panel. It's great to meet you all for the first time, and I'm so glad you came here, and I hope you'll continue to participate in the MEA with the field of media ecology. We can talk about it. I've taken over, I've stepped in as editor of Explorations in Media Ecology. So I welcome submissions for that, for the journal. Just tossing it out to the folks everywhere. So thank you.
If you're always first time at MEA, your first time at MEA, if you have the hubris to just come and pretend as though you are Neil Postman, the anniversary of the book, and they don't kick you out, maybe that's the best way to try to get you to count. Thank you. If there are questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Elizabeth, I really enjoyed your presentation, and McLuhan probed sex, death, and technology with mosaic writing, so it evokes your quilting interest. But it was actually the French newspapers in like 1898, they said there's a new contraption out, cinema, movies, and we'll never have to die. So a lot of you talked on death. The question's for you and all of the panelists. Can we forget to die?
Well, I would say that's a very interesting question, and I'll think about it. What I do think is that a lot of media invite us to forget about it for a period of time. And there may be benefit in that for us, a little bit, some of the time, but I think sometimes entertaining ourselves to death means that we are spending too much time entertaining ourselves and not enough time contemplating the transcendent and life.
Yeah, and I would add to that, sort of in Egyptian metaphysics, there's kind of this concept that every day we die when we go to sleep, and that forgetting to sleep is a form of, I guess, forgetting to die in a way, right? And that you kind of experience this resurrection every morning. You wake up alive, and you're like, wow, that's great. So I think there's a sense in which, and media is a good example of that too. Our technological devices often keep us up late, wasting time, wasting sleep time for a lot of things.
Yeah.
I always thought it was a humorous way Postman would talk about something we all take for granted, the cruise control in our cars. And now, if he were alive today, would not make his head explode that we have driverless cars. Some of the younger people in this room will probably own one. That, or what would it be that would just totally, almost drive him, would seem crazy if you,
Yeah.
what particular technologies would particularly just drive him crazy?
Nothing would drive him crazy because he wasn't that, he'd take everything with very good humor. So that wouldn't be a good characterization of his response. But please go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think he would really be annoyed with the proliferation of what we call online education and classroom technology. I mean, at our institution, information technology has now become its own little entity. Nobody speaks their language, and we get paid a lot, and they're always in demand. And I guess having read not as much as a lot of you about Neil Postman, but boy, reading technology, I got a strong sense that he wants education to be human beings talking to each other.
There's a great video, and I mean, even though it's very old, I still use it. And it's like an educational video. It's got like a few different names, so it's hard to pin down. But one of them is From Socrates to Cyberspace, and it includes an interview with Postman broken up, many different pieces. And he uses the analogy of a child without a father. That you have a child without a father, and that's tragic. And you could say, well, we can set up a system where other people will step in and spend time with the child and try to make up for it. But it's still sad that the child doesn't have a father. And in the same way, you can say, well, it's too inconvenient or too hard somehow to provide in-person education, but we should weep about that we shouldn't celebrate it. And then he said, I've shown it so many times, I remember this almost word for word, but there's nothing more beautiful than just a student and a teacher engaging face to face.
I want to say that I really appreciate the creative approach of the panel. I thought it was great. This is a question, I have two questions. First, to all the panelists. In reading Postman, one thing that I got from reading Postman in graduate school is that he had a very distinct voice. And I heard that voice to some extent from you guys. Could maybe one or two of you comment on Postman's voice? And then also, who's the sociologist? Who's the sociologist?
Social scientists.
Social science.
We're all in communication, but two of us are.
Okay.
And two of us are rhetoricians and two of us are social scientists. Maybe you should guess.
I think Elizabeth is one
I
What and
think,
what?
social scientist.
Wow.
Because you said measurement.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, but rhetoricians measures things.
I think Edward is the second one.
What's that?
I think Edward is the second one.
Yep, you got that right. And then it's me. And these two are rhetoricians. Yeah.
But Postman's voice.
Talk about his voice. Yeah.
It will captivate. His voice. There's so many ways you can take his voice as he wrote, and his voice to listen to. One of the ways that I'm from New York, so to fall into that New York brogue, I'll call it, is something that's very natural for me. But to be able to replicate that gravelly.
Well, I don't mean dialect. I mean
Right.
his way of constructing a character.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, right. Just his ability to make you comfortable, the way he would talk, the way he would write, to make you feel comfortable with the material, and bring you into it, rather than say, this is what I know, as opposed to keeping you out, you need to learn from me. He just had a really good way of making a connection through his voice, to make it resonate.
Yeah.
What I find when I'm reading him too, that he has this really strong ability to make things seem really simple. But when you really, if you listen to what he's saying, there's a lot of depth to it. And it's hard, I guess it's hard to recreate that, I suppose, but I am certainly aware of that capacity that he has to speak to you as if he's almost in the same room with you, even in his writing, and to do it in a relatively plain, simple way, but then it also has a lot of complex ideas there.
Yeah, what I would add to that, I think first of all, I appreciate at all that you heard a little bit of it. That's writing these essays was itself, it's sort of a surprise benefit of doing it was to realize how good Postman's ideas are. It's one thing to try to find the meter, to try to find the cadence, to try to find the language or the clarity, but to couple that with the kind of ideas, the kind of insight was a real challenge. This is hard. And I don't know that I've ever done that. It's not often that as scholars we try to write as someone else's voice, and that was an interesting exercise. I think I'd do it again, but
I was just thinking of something I read in one of Lance Straight's essays that Postman's sort of motto was clarity is courage in terms of writing. You read a lot of academic stuff that is so convoluted and pretentious that you have to go back every once in a while and read more.
Yeah.
But the clarity in everything he writes, it's unambiguous, it's clear.
And I wanted to add with regard to voice, we didn't all write essays. One of the things I ended up, because I thought we had 15 minutes and then I was told 10 and then I was told 11. So I chopped out Ken Thurman and I chopped out a lot of other rhetoricians and a whole lot, you would have known it was rhetorician. But what I didn't want to do was to try quickly to decide to read to you. And so what I tried to do was to embody a different kind of extemporaneous voice. And I get the feeling that he was funny and a sense of humor in his writing, and he's never very ironic, but never apologetic about a pun that he made or some sort of thing. He's a hoot. I really appreciated Aaron's book, Alice too.
I liked your paper about how information on technology shapes the human being. And my question is, do you think every technology, let's just say the Twitter founder ever thought how Twitter would influence an election, for example? So they create this technology and then they leave that technology to the ethics of people. It's like a Frankenstein. So you create something and then it evolves in the way that it is the people who is going to give an end to that technology, or it's a means. Technology is a connector between people and powers. And there is this infosphere that is shaping our values and our ends. What do you think of that?
I think you're right, and I think that was a distinction I was trying to make between the phrase, what it was intended to do, attributing that as a value on the part of its creator, on the one hand, and what it's designed to do, which means all the mischief you can do, including those what we might deem to be misuses of technology that would lead to the election of a president in a particular mission in a particular year.
It's interesting too. I mean, it's a great thought. I'm sure many of you know Tim Berners-Lee, who's credited with creating the internet. Was a couple of years ago, and not happy with how it's grown up at all, apparently. So.
Well, Marconi introduced the wireless and thought it was going to be for person-to-person communication. Suddenly it's being used mostly for radio broadcasting. He was very unhappy with that.
But what a great idea that it's the people.
Arthur Kessler says the sleepwalkers, inventors, discoverers, or sleepwalkers. They know not what they do.
And then the self that gets developed in the 140 character limitations in response to mean-spirited other, I guess I'm seeing profound truth in what you observed, and that makes a difference. That technology circumscribes what it means to be a self and a citizen, an American, in my case.
I think we're past time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Me, I did my